Structuring tabular information and definition lists are key components of web page layouts. We will see some intended and unintended uses for using tables and form an understanding of what coding principles are appropriate and under what conditions. Let's look at what happens when we hard code layout using tables and what the consequences are in terms of our flexibility of our XHTML. In this lesson, we'll learn how to create tables and put data inside those tables as a means of controlling layout in our web pages. Now you might be saying to yourself, well, we've been learning methods building up towards the point where we could separate completely layout from data. Why would we want to learn a means of hard coding content within a fixed layout structure? Some resources will tell you never ever ever use tables for anything other than tabular data. And philosophically, I would agree with that. However, the fact of the matter is that as you begin your career as a website designer, you are going to find that almost everywhere you go, people are using tables as a means of laying out their pages. This largely is thanks to history, because in previous generations of HTML, the tools that were available to you to govern layout were very limited. Tables was one of the few means available for putting data in particular places on our page. And throughout the 1990s, tables were the primary means used on the majority of websites for governing layout of pages. In an upcoming chapter, we'll explore fully the separation of content from layout and begin to see the many benefits of that elegant separation and the power that it will give you as a designer. But there are a few circumstances when you will want to use tables, and even a few when you will need to use tables, such as when you create web pages that are intended to be used in emails. But the more likely case, when you'll need to use tables to do page layout, is when you need to do a page layout fast, because it's generally speaking easier to do layout with tables than with cascading style sheets and div tags, which we'll explore in a future chapter, only because we don't have to do as much upfront planning as we would as if we were using the box model with style sheets and div tags. Tables are often the quick and dirty, fast way of accomplishing layout for our pages. So let's get started. If we take a look in the Chapter 7 folder, you should find a file called tables.htm. We're going to work with this file for the next several lessons. I'll open tables.htm in my web editing tool, which in this case is TextEdit. I'll launch TextEdit by double-clicking on the TextEdit icon, and then from the File menu I'll select Open, and from the Chapter 7 folder I'll find tables.htm and open that file, and I can see a blank HTML document. Now in this document I will build the basic structure for a table, which we'll build upon in subsequent lessons. First, I'll define the basic syntax of the table, and then we'll flush out some of the attributes that allow us to control the presentation of that table. To begin creating a table element, we'll start with the opening table tag. And I'll hit the return key several times to give myself a few more lines, and I'll close the table tag so that I don't forget. Now, if you've ever used a spreadsheet program, such as those from Microsoft or OpenOffice, you're familiar with the concept of rows and tables for structuring tabular data. Tables are organized under the same principle, rows and columns for containing data. And subsequently, the tags that we use in our table to define rows and columns are TR for table row, which I'll close immediately as soon as I create it. And within our rows, we'll work with cells, which when we have multiple cells in a row, we essentially have columns. But for right now, I'll create one cell for a single unit of tabular data, or a TD tag, which I'll close immediately. Now we're going to work extensively with the TD and tr tags, but for right now I'm going to focus on the opening table tag. I'm going to position my mouse within our opening table tag and define some attributes that will govern the presentation of this table. To begin with, let's say we want our table to span the entire width of our web page. We have a width attribute that we can use to specify the width of our table in either percentage or in pixels. In this case, I'm going to specify the width of my table as a percent. And in this case, within the quotes of our width attribute, I'll specify 100 and then the percent sign so that this table will take up the full width of my web page. Then, I'm going to specify a border because I want a single line to outline the perimeter of my table. So, as we've seen before with the image tag, we have a border attribute, which we can use here on our table. So we'll type border equals quote quote, and I'll type a value of 1 for our border attribute. Another attribute that we have available to us is cell padding, and that attribute reads as cell padding equals quote quote. Cell padding sets the amount of space between the contents of the cell and the cell wall. This is very similar to the attributes we've seen in the box model, which we referred to in a previous lesson. But for our purposes, cell padding is the amount of space between the contents of the cell and the cell wall. So to give us a little bit of space inside our cells, I'll specify a value of 5. And the last attribute that we'll look at when creating our table is cell spacing. Which in this case I'll set as 0. So, to review, cell padding controls the amount of space within our cells and the content of that cell, where our cell spacing controls the space between our cells. I'll now save this file, tables.htm, under the File menu. Open up my web browser by double-clicking on the Firefox icon on the Mac, and then open our tables file from the Chapter 7 folder. And I can see a fairly unspectacular table, as we haven't populated any content into our single row and our single cell, but I can see that as I change the size of my web browser, the size of the table is automatically scaling to 100% of the available space. Also, I have a 1 pixel border around the perimeter of my table, which we specified as an attribute in our HTML code.